hope this all inspires curiosity and participation. So let's begin with Alfredo. I leave the mic to you. If you'd like to share your screen, it's ready. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Disney films. So you can see my Disney film collection. Now, are you seeing the presentation? Yes, yes. Perfect. Okay. So now it's the turn of anthropology. We went through geology, political science, and now I've been wanting to share with you a few ideas that is anthropology and the project that we have been looking for a multidisciplinary approach. And there were various that could have been worked on the risk management topic, psychology, sociology. And so with these relations that have entered through this discipline of anthropology, that's what my manner of investigation is. And so I've been constructing this multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach is the necessity of identifying and recognizing from where are proposed these certain approaches. And this is a very rich practice. So from the perspective of anthropology, I'm going to do a little bit more about the history of the discipline to try and help define the point of the perspective of the actor, and which it develops a lot from the perspective of the actor. So, and at the end, I'm going to try and focus on how this search of the actor has a certain way of going through anthropology. So anthropology, as a social science and most sciences in general, has an origin that has to do with the 19th century. So in this intellectual climate in Europe that had a lot to do with the construction of science and different disciplines that were constructed along with the modern sciences. In this sense, anthropology is part of this synonymic process of knowledge. And so this is founded at the end of the 19th century, this school. So the first form of anthropology was always related with cultural diversity and from the European perspective, but there never existed the idea that knowing these cultures are not European involved a field study. So at least 30 years or 40 years where it wasn't necessary to go to these places to know these cultures. So how did they get to know them? Mostly through fragmented reports and reports of colonial. So the anthropology was very speculative. And during that time, there were very few dates, and they were fragmented and disorganized and methodologically very weak. So the affirmations over these societies were very generalized. And in anthropology, there was a reconstruction of the discipline through this Polish anthropologist, and during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Milisnovsky. Milisnovsky is considered the refounder of anthropology, and this happened in about 1914. So this begins to show not just a science, but a field of anthropology. So these are a few images that show the quality of this field. So here's Marinovsky with people of the islands of Tribune. And it's very curious, this image, when we look at it now. He's dressed, they are not. He is white, they are not. So all of the colonialization that surges from this discipline, and this is going to be a central topic during all of the development of anthropology. So a little of what we see here is a direct contact. The knowledge of this society is generated with this direct contact with the population that was studied. So what came out of this process was ethnography, like a work of a text. And through this process of Marinovsky in the Travian Islands was a foundational approach of anthropology. And this book came out of it, The Argonauts of the Pacific. So this was only possible in a particular context, and that's really important. So these conditions of production of knowledge. So the first, so to separate the different sciences, science from nature, from man, and in the search for try to compartmentalize reality for different scientific studies, there was a very interesting debate. That was the debate of non-ethical, non-ethical, which had to do with more with laws, the regularities, the sciences that study the regularities. So from this perspective, those who had a strong load of art, strong study in art and literature, they didn't try to define the search of laws, but through the search of particularities. And so anthropology really takes this route of trying to be an empirical science, but not through the search of irregularities, but the search of particularities, which each society does and what each society knows what it is. So one thing that could be considered universal is that all of the society establishes differences in how they organize, who are the families, who's in family, who's not, who in matrimonies. And so there's the parentescal lay, that law that was not found among all the societies. So through the trajectory of Marinovsky, he began with the physical and mathematical sciences. That was his first scientific approach in Cracovia. And then he went making some different routes, studying biology and economy in London. And he was also interested in psychology. So he got a doctorate in sciences that were not anthropology. And this had a lot to do with his field work. But more than his formation, Malinowski he's grounded in linguistics. because his father was a philosophist and his mother was a linguist. So he had a chance to study in Germany, and he spoke various languages. So I say this so that it may not have been the discipline, but he acquired this through a different way, defining the importance of a language as the medium of access to a culture. So anthropology looks from that perspective and that idea, but the important part is with the knowledge, there's the use of a lot of disciplines. There's a holistic knowledge and ethnographic knowledge. What was the unity? The unity was the culture, which implies the economy, the religion, technology, different forms of thinking. And so it wasn't just studying the economy or the symbolism or the religious practices or their nutritionary system or any other material. So from this perspective, all of the aspects of social life were joined together holistically in a small group. So the idea is one language is a culture. So one thing that's fundamental when we talk about where this idea comes from, this idea of field work, how do we arrive to a point like this? It's not easy. The societies are not waiting that an anthropologist arrives to ask questions. So in a certain way, there was a certain path that was already made from colonization, and those were the places that were chosen to do anthropology, because the geopolitics had determined that these societies were in these conditions and were available to be investigated. On the other hand, a culture could say, no, we're not interested in what you want to do. But in a certain way, there were already things that had established this. And so the geopolitical situation specifically, and these relationships, not just economical, political, but also the idea was to generate knowledge. So we'll look at this and from the different anthropological cases, which is fantastic. Obviously, when Marinovsky goes to England to study, he does it in a place which is on the jurisdiction of Italy, but he had Austrian Hungarian passport, and during the First World War, since he was seen as a foreigner and from one of the enemy countries, it made him return to England and stay in England in the colonial of the empire. And so he had certain stays in Australia, but his strong point of field work had to do with the circumstances that we have to go to do field work. But in his case, he had to stay trapped in field work and couldn't return to the university where he had left from. So we'll see this a little bit more ahead. There's Eurocentrism, and at the beginning of the 20th century, what was happening? The theories of evolution. Where could we study the evolution? In the primitive societies, we could look at the older perspective of the non-civilized societies. And so there was an interest in Australia and in that part of Polynesia, Melanesia. And so this was a laboratory in place where evolution was being studied. So in Australia, there was a lot of interest in psychoanalysis and the boom then over the psychoanalytical studies. So this in the primitive studies to try to understand the first social norms and the tendency for incest. So in these societies where incest was happening in Australia, he was very interested in these areas. So the interest in what is primitive, and he had a lot of interest in this geography, in this region. So always in anthropology, this sounds like the original sin, a field of study that was based on colonialism. It's true. These were the conditions that allowed for this knowledge to develop. So we're going to look at what comes out of this production of knowledge. As I commented, Marinovsky stays trapped in the Trobriand Islands, and he has to stay there. Nevertheless, this was an opportunity to study all of these cultures instead of the fragmented data that was had before. Now there was the experience in situ. What Marinovsky said during 1915, 1916 was live in a religious camp or a camp of the British colonial camps and make visits to the communities and then return to the camps. He lived with the colonizers, but he would establish a field of study in the communities. And then he decided not to return to the religious mission and put a tent in the same community where he was studying. This was an option. He could have stayed in the field for 4 years, living in the communities, or with the British camp or the religious camp, but he chose to reside with the community and not return to the religious mission and put his tent in the community. And so there he is with a phonograph in the picture. And the people are very curious about these instruments that he had. He doesn't talk about this a lot in his work, but these people of the community were very fascinated by all these materials that he had. So at the beginning of this co-residence and the option to live there, it's not just something material, but also symbolic, because it implies that to get close to this community, it means leaving aside the backup of his country, the support of his country, his language, and abandon oneself and live sad isolation, as many anthropologists say. This was an option that was an option at this time. And so this is kind of the beginning of field work, making co-residences as the ideal, having to live with the community, eat their food, live with them, participate in their daily life, and live as they live. This has been seen in anthropology, but it seen in other fields like sociology, that co-residence is not something that is found there. Instead, anthropology is seen as the ideal fieldwork in this method. But I want to show where this came from. So during the co-residence, through co-receiving these people, it creates a subjective perspective. To know these people, you have to have a friendship with them. You have to create a relationship that's empathic. You cannot just know these people on a deeper level just as a foreigner or someone from the outside. So this is one of the principles of anthropology, to reach this subjective perspective. What is the jewel that is experienced is the subjective perspective, because this creates a reality before different questions and before participating in the social life need to break the references of what a foreigner would say about these communities. It's breaking certain limits of communication and coming to a form of understanding how the people think. So just thinking about this exercise, if I think about a neighborhood and I go to a neighborhood and talk to the woman who works in a store, probably she's going to tell me something, a common sense response, something that everyone says, something more superficial than what is really there. So the idea of having a deeper view is having a closer relationship to then understand a little better the situation. So this is kind of the central point here. So what implies, what complexity does the point of view have? In the first place, when Marinovsky is interested in a topic, for example, the rituals, he studied a form of different jewelry, bracelets, necklaces that were called kuya. And so what is that? What does it mean when one exchanges a necklace with somebody and then it's returned? It's not a trick or an exchange. It's something that is given but then returned, and they're objects that are highly valued. These necklaces, to receive them is a great success for each person, even though they're not going to be used. So when Marinovsky starts to see these processes, he learns this idea of what something means. This, for example, this exchange of necklaces is, we can only understand this if we understand the parentescal system, the spiritual system, and so none of this happens in an isolated way, but it happens in a systemic way, in an ample way. So in a project, what does it mean for people to live in a high-risk zone? It means the daily life, and without understanding their economy, their trajectory, the way they use their resources. So having this holistic view will allow to having understanding that these beliefs are not isolated. It has to do with their whole situation. So many of these studies about risk don't have this perspective, And so what people think about risk has to do with an isolated perspective, an isolated point of view. And this is a problem because you just can't take this opinion without understanding everything. So this is the first point. The second point, what is a point of view? It's not a personal creation. In this point of view, there's a process of learning, a socialization process. So that's to say, it's a social knowledge. What it reflects is what has been learned, the different knowledge and values that are found in the context of where someone is brought up or lives. So these ideas have to do with the different societies, not just the people who live in these societies, but to say in another way, in the discourse of the person, behind is the discourse, the social discourse. So another point is that Marinovsky in these tribes finds a community that's not just based on common sense. There's differences between men and women, young people and children. And in some way, the exchange for one person is not the same as others. So the women may see it in one way and the men may see it in a different way, this exchange of necklaces. So this is something that's understood through the culture and in the collective culture of values, the roles of the men, of the women, and how the men see certain events in one way and women in another way. So there's a certain marginalization in these communities. So Marinovsky looks for all of these different voices so he can understand how it is lived in more of an ensemble instead of in an individual way. So to understand point of views is complex. To understand of a person or a group is not easy because it's not understood in a superficial way. In rural communities, for example, how they express this way of asking questions then marks the answer. So if they see 4x4 trucks coming to ask them questions in these rural communities, what is then marked is the distance between who is asking the question and who answers. So these answers are taken, well, the people told me this, but under what context were you told these answers? What did the people want when they told you those answers? These are serious questions that anthropology asks and show us that there's a point of view and complexity behind all of this. So in terms of anthropology, with a lot of methodological innovations, the social change became the big topic. One of the main points that interested primitive societies was that they saw that these societies saw that they would soon be colonized or be wiped out for expansion of the modern civilization. So they had to be studied fast, and because they were in risk of deteriorating their civilization. So each thing that happened with the modern society and the things that started to appear in these communities in the 1970s, we see this cartoon where we see the natives hiding the modern technology because the anthropologists are coming, but they want to hide all of these comfortable objects, and they want them to be seen. They want themselves to be seen as more native and primitive. So they're hiding these objects. So it's a fantastic cartoon that shows what happened through this discipline of anthropology. So this continued until the 1980s or 90s, where this type of anthropology almost disappears because of the crisis of representation. So what is this crisis of representation? What began to be questioned was not the objective or methods, but all of this functioned, as we saw during colonization, through different inequalities, structural inequalities that are based on colonization. So you would arrive to different towns, and so they would attract more people than others. So this was the ethnographic issue that arose. So Marinovsky, what do the representatives think of these studies that Marinovsky and other anthropologists represented? Do they see themselves being represented or not? This was an atomic bomb in the discipline, because all of what had been reproduced seemed to not have sense anymore. The natives themselves could say whether yes or no. And so this was a crisis that was very important. How to understand this then? From the formal colonial world, during the 70s, during the decolonization of Africa, it had broken the global system that permitted anthropology, which was colonization. So it being broken, then it opened another possibility to understand diversity from the Western perspective. So the anthropologists of the South, where a lot of these centers of anthropology in Europe and the United States did their field work, that after the second half of the 20th century, they began to study and teach anthropology. So there were natives that began to become anthropologists. And so in India, this is a fantastic case where there was a lot of people leaving India to study anthropology. These are people who were studied by anthropologists, and they read the texts, the sacred texts that talked about their societies, and they ask themselves, this is not how it is. I come from this culture, and what they're saying about us is not precise. And so these anthropologists of the South will break in the different presentations and seminars, and these cultures and these go through a lot of transformation as well. Through the 60s and 70s, these cultures changed a lot, very strongly. And so this becomes a whole topic from the 1980s for anthropology, this idea of how to talk of the other. And this will become a topic that we work on until today. The rupture that became the most important part of the discipline. So what is in the background of this? So here's an exercise. What do you see when you see me? In these descriptions, something appears of this person, but more, what is seen is who is investigating. So in the representation of these societies, you can see clearly values and different type ways of thinking of the investigators. And so how is this resolved, and who has the authority to say who is the other? The one who sees them from the outside? So only the people of one group could then talk about themselves, and this creates other paradoxes. So we can only talk about ourselves, and we would not have the authority, the intellectual or moral authority to say anything about other people. And this implies that each society, the only one to talk about that society is people from that society, and that makes them immune to criticism. And so what happens with cultural activism and the different hierarchical organization of different tribes, of the women, of disabled people, we would have to respect the rights, and nobody could say anything about that. It would be a completely relativistic perspective. So those who are within a culture can see it objectively, but that's not really true. So to see a culture from within and the different parameters that they have been socialized with, but the point of the discussion is that neither one was a secure place for making observations. The observation from outside or within were both not trustworthy. So this led to rethinking the whole ethnographic perspective. So how do we talk about another? What are some of the guidelines in order to do this work? Here we have some of the different ideas. The first is reflection. If there's not a posture that has to about, the important part is to be explicit about the pre-notions and the process of obtaining the knowledge. Am I getting closer to the reality, or are my ideas influencing my judgment of the others? What prejudices are involved in my observation? So now the question is not how are the others, but how do I see them? So taking the relative perspective or the partial perspective is to be explicit about where the observation is coming from. Who am I talking about, and how am I constructing this knowledge? How does the culture make me emphasize certain elements of their culture? And it becomes very important to be a partial knowledge, and I seen as a partial knowledge. From the classical epoch, we see that an investigation can never substitute or show the universal perspective, just a partial approach. So the evolution of information, the access to the information, so that the other will have access to the information and they can share about what is written or shared about them. This means that there will be a validation. So if I say something and it's only valid if I say it's valid, but that's not true. So the idea is that the anthropologist makes an interpretation of how they see these persons. But it's not a box of resonance. It includes how the people see themselves, how the people see them, or how does it seem that the people see the things that they are living. It's a little difficult to understand, but it's a double interpretation. So the important part is that this knowledge is constructed through dialogue, through a cultural posture and empathic posture, and it looks for a strong explanation. So the people could be or not be in support of this. So it's a partial perspective. They're not one people saying how the others are, but they're putting into play an appreciation of the same people who are being studied, and they can accept partially this affirmation. So it's more of a horizontal perspective. So there's a certain sensibility with this perspective on how these relations are constructed and how we propose the project of the hub and the methodologies of follow-up and how the knowledge is being constructed. It has a lot to do with this process of reflection. So all of the knowledge through trying to identify this, what is transferred from the investigator to the reality, not just learning from the reality, but also things that are transferred from the investigator and how that world is seen in this way. These ideas of how to do anthropology remain in use and are what are taught in schools of anthropology through the crisis of representation. So this has radically changed the manner of how fieldwork is done. What has occurred in the discipline referring to risk? I'm not a specialist in this. I'm just beginning to get into this topic of risk. So there is an important history to this. And so this work of Mary Douglas that has to do with the acceptability of risk according to the social sciences. So have environmental risk, information risk. There's little reference to earthquakes or natural disasters, which we are working with, but here are some fantastic ideas. So this was my first look at anthropology here. How does this implicate risk? Well, there's very simple ideas for the years of the 1990s, for example. It was not important to wear a safety belt, for example. They had it, but people didn't use it. Or I don't know if we see now when we compare with our infancy or the infancy of today, how many precautions are taken today when someone goes out and bicycle with a helmet. I don't remember anyone in my childhood wearing a helmet on a bicycle. So what Mary Douglas tries to do in this work is to look at how people take different actions based on the knowledge that they have over different risks. And what is the manner of facing these risks in the daily life? Even with financial risks, she makes investigations and talking about speculation of capital and all of the different things that have to do with the risk. And it leaves with us these preoccupations, these worries. So as a good anthropologist, and have worked with a lot of classic topics of anthropology, she learned about the creation of different cultures and how they are permitted to think in different ways. And this topic, which I think is very interesting, is the subjective immunity that has to do with uncertain topics. She says that in what types of senses, in a danger, the grave danger is not grave, and the dangers that happen rare times. She tries to look at in the different ways of these dangers, how do we experience them? I want to emphasize about this cultural adaptation. I'm going to present a different example. An anthropologist from the United States who worked a long time in Brazil in rural areas, in impoverished areas, she finds that the life is precarious. The survival of these children is very difficult, and there's many children. There's a lot of young pregnant women. And so at the beginning, her first impression that was heavily impacted was this indolence of the mothers over the children. With recently born babies, the mothers didn't show them a lot of attention. They mostly learned to survive on their own. And this seemed to her a cultural disposition that created a certain indolence about death or acceptance of death, something that they could not control. So even with the children with 1 or 2 years of age, they did not care for these children a lot, but not that much happened to these children. But when they would die at 7 or 8 years of age, this produced a strong pain over these young women. So it went changing the lack of control and the regressed growth of these different women. But once these children had lived to a certain age and had a certain probability of living, then it became much more important. So it's important to emphasize the potence of these different cultural narratives. So this subjective perspective could turn into a reality for the people. And the difficulties don't have to do with material adaptations, whether it be doing different projects, I don't know, but more to do from a subjective perspective, having to do with the meaning of what has happened. This is the type of what I'm going to finish with this. How do people explain the disgraces? When successful things happen in European cultures, success is explained through individual success. For one person, it happened because they're intelligent, but the failures are more difficult to explain. So the different narratives from different situations that have to do with failures, who is responsible for this, who didn't do what, how have these experiences of vulnerability happened. So the understanding of dangers have more to do with moral and ideas of justice and probability of the cost benefit and the accepting of risk. So I think this is what anthropology can share with the project, and the crisis of representation, how this getting closer to other people happens. This is the presentation, colleagues. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Thank you, Alfredo. Really, really interesting. And I really enjoyed this presentation. It led to a lot of me being curious. I didn't have any idea. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the list of participants. Giuseppe, you're first. Giuseppe, we can't hear you.
Hello. Okay.
Hola.
Hola. Alfredo, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question related to the idea of fieldwork. When I talk with anthropologists, I am a geographer, there is always this conflict around what does it mean doing fieldwork, how long it should take. Of course, there is not a specific answer, but how do you see an anthropological perspective within an interdisciplinary project like the work we are doing in the Quito Hub? So the time scale of, let's say, an anthropologist and, let's say, a geomorphologist or a volcanologist is the same, or where you can find some connection, or where do you find some difficulties in merging two so different disciplines? Thanks.
¿Voy respondiendo o vamos a juntar preguntas? Creo que tal vez mejor juntamos.
Entonces, sí, de acuerdo. Camilo.
Okay, yep, we're gonna take some more questions. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alfredo, for the presentation. I think the ones that work in physical sciences, we appreciate a lot this perspective. One thing that I think is really important additionally is in the social sciences, we see that there's a lot we need to break with this subjective perspective. So there could be these risks that the people ignore. So there's all that we need to expose, but this is a grave risk. And so what you said in the last slide, these benefits of managing this point is, so my question has to do a little bit with, so how are the people that are working in a hub, especially those working on case studies, is it necessary to break this idea of you all and us to create a relationship with the communities? Every time we have seen during the last times work creating friendships, but what is the best way to break this barrier in the communities that marks us between us that come from outside and the people of the community? A question that goes towards the side of the ethics, and Terry has a question. Terry, I'm not going to try and answer the question for Alfredo, but I think what could help us is reflection of Alfredo about the flexibility and positioning, something that you as an anthropologist knows about. So how do you think that we can bring this reflection about where we all come from different disciplines to this investigation, whether it be Camilo, me, the anthropologist? How can anthropology help us so that all of us in the hub, I do this. I have suggested field journals where we can talk about this, discussions in the field, and we can think about our different subjective perspectives and how it's transferred to the investigation. So I want to ask you, what is your suggestion of how to bring these reflections to all of our different areas of work? Thank you. I think with that, you have enough questions, or do you want more questions, Alfredo? No. You assaulted me with complex questions, but that's exactly the goal of this, to generate knowledge. There are 3 questions, very potent, and I don't find how to respond to all of them, so I'm going to try and approach them one by one. The question about time, we see that this involves time investment. So if we talk about the practice of these studies, in the year that we have looked at working, it was an optimistic option from one way of looking at it. I think the time is an important factor, but it's not the ultimate factor. The ultimate factor is how to build trust. We know this is going to take some time, and the people are not going to have trust in the beginning. But if we approach this through just the amount of time, it could be that this time will pass, but the trust has not been built. So why is time needed? I think that's the central question. Time is needed so that the intentions are made explicit. So the people are going to get to know us. If we just go and present ourselves, introduce ourselves, they're not going to know us. They're going to know us by interacting with the people, and we will generate more of a connection. So that's the perspective of what to do when they ask us for help. They have asked for us to interact, and we get along, so we need to interact. So how do we give ourselves to this interaction? What role do we play in this interaction? It's through this interaction that we're going to construct trust or not. So the central point, I think, is that trying to interact the most possible. Then we're going to get to know each other. We think about the different relations among different people. How does one get to know another person? Is it just simply by getting a business card? No, it's when we start talking about something. And when we interact, that's where we find it. So in these moments of COVID, which all of the anthropologists are doing field work in the world, are faced with not being able to leave. And many are paralyzed And so someone was talking in the back. So more what we have talked about with different colleagues that are faced with this situation is what was the essence of anthropology? What is the essence? It is the social work. Follow the social life. And the social life continues with the quarantine. So we can't just hope that it ends, but rather adapt the mode to follow and continue to work with what's happening, because this is going to continue to happen. The social life continues, and we're going to find different ways to, if one had thought the only way to do this is to go to the field, but that was an adaptation. Let's think about it that way. But what's happening is we need another adaptation. We need to use the tools in order to do it. And so for the question of Giuseppe, how is this seen from different disciplines? I think what needs to be developed is a sensibility to the points. It's not just the immediate response when I ask someone a question and they give me an answer. It could be anyone in any discipline, social science or natural science, but the point of the actor, the point of view of the actor, as we all can acquire this sensibility to think that the point of view of the actor is always deeper than what we think. So I don't want in the hub that we think that this is something that can only be done in anthropology, or only the geologists can know certain things, or better, more importantly, it's how do we go through this of the different disciplines and realize that it's important for all of us. Learn to read on a deeper level the different points of view. Obviously, the big advantage is that we're working in team. It's not just anthropology. So by being in a team, we can begin to construct this and put it in practice permanently. Camilo had said that when one finds these different cultural perspectives, like one wants to think that they want to correct a person, that something could happen as far as risk. This is the most common manner of how to address a problem. The people don't know, or they don't want to know, and we have to make them see it, open their eyes. So this seems to me very violent, to open the eyes of the people as though they could not see on their own. So the idea of anthropology is, how is this point of view made? How has it been developed? How is it formed through different experiences? Not judge them as when we meet them, but see it as a way to resolve uncertainties. So to understand, and when we understand, then act. I don't dare to say right now how this has been constructed. So I'm not so sure about the recommendations, because we haven't done this working closely with the community, building these relationships. The important part now is to know that we are going to find with conclusions that make sense to the people, that will make a large assembly of the ideas of what is important for them, what worries them, what does not. And so I propose this idea of starting to look at what could happen in which act that we make, then we would be paralyzed. So if we think every time we leave in a car, we're going to have an accident, then it's hard to. So in each person does not select what to put care to and what not to. If we're just paralyzed, how has this been constructed as far as what worries me and what doesn't worry me? So this is not something that only happens with people who are living with vulnerabilities. It's a manner of the society of what worries me and what doesn't worry me. What should I focus on and what should I not focus on? So this is an important part. Camilo also made a question about the idea of us and them. In anthropology, when they say that there's an expert, that the idea is to become the other. And it's not about becoming the other. It's to be empathic with the other before becoming the other. That is to say, there's always going to be a difference between us and them. That's not a problem. We don't have to be the same. Neither they have to be us, nor do we have to convert ourselves into them. That's not the point. The point is that we can dialogue. We can discuss their perspective and ours. And we can be, it's more important to be empathic than trying to adapt and convert ourselves into these people. It's not about that. The idea is more of a symmetrical anthropology, one that's more horizontal. It's to be transparent that we come from the universities, we work with this reasoning, and so that's more important than assimilating to others. So the question of Tere and about reflection and positioning, how to apply this would be the question. I don't know if through meetings in the field. I think normally that anthropological work, which is less multidisciplinary and more isolated, it does have the resource of a field journal and field meetings as a first filter. It could be a tool. I had not thought about it that much. I think the project does have this idea of monitoring the learning process, that the project has it, can be applied on a different scale. So before creating another front to face, apply this same principle to smaller work that we do, not just the bigger part of the project. So how are we going to meet the communities? How are we going to get to know them on small scale, middle scale, and large scale? When we report how we've learned about Quito and all of this learning, wouldn't it be easy if we propose that all of us are going to make a daily journal and meetings? It will involve a lot of practice and less knowledge, but it has to be put into practice. I think we're going to have to do it through the process, because then doubts are going to come up. And so we're going to have to construct this, and this could be a good way of doing it. There's a response to this, that how do we go about meeting the other in anthropology? Not just anthropology, But us, this is what I learned from my anthropology professor. When we do this exercise and we try to learn about other people and there's cultural systems, but you wind up learning more about yourself because you start to learn about how your system works, how your things work. So I think the reflection does permit that and learning more about oneself. And that was what Camilo was saying as well. So how, when you get closer to another, you get closer to your own self. And so this is something that's very important in anthropology, and how we are going to learn through this process. Yes, I am in agreement with Tere. I don't know if there's more questions. I had a question or comment about your presentation, Alfredo. When you told us this, it made me think about something that's from physical science, that we like to measure things. And in few words, what you're saying is that the result of what one measures depends on the person who's measuring, like the anthropologist. So this is something that the physical scientists don't like to hear, but it does happen. And it does happen in physical sciences. In the mechanics of it, it depends on the observer. So that leaves our head flying a little bit, but I do accept it. And I do see it as totally possible. But what's attracting my attention a little bit is that those who are going to observe are from two different cultures, not just one. What do you think could happen amongst ourselves? We are two different interdisciplinary groups, but also two different cultures that are the observers. We come from two different cultures. How could this benefit or produce unexpected results? Oh, great, Danielle, what you have proposed here. So about the topic of, so I think that the mediation has to do with objectivity. Oh, the measuring is a construction. It's an abstract construction that allows us to measure. So something very basic. This example, the number of average children if Ecuadorian women is 3.4. So that means that each Ecuadorian woman has 3 children and one with half a body. So this data, this is saying something that doesn't make any sense, that a person could have 3/4 of a body. Because why don't we focus on this data? Because we know it's an abstraction. We know about the scale, the division, and in the reality, there do not exist half persons. So I just want to share this so that we think about measuring is one form of making something objective. So social sciences also have forms of being objective. And there's the measurement, the data about that which is social. But there's another type of data which has to do with the social side. And they're not completely subjective, but they could be something that's somewhat objective and involves our form of thinking. They're establishing semantic networks. So we could talk a lot about a neighborhood, about the people, but through these narratives, We organize what are the nuclei that make sense of these narratives. The differences, for example, between the probable and the improbable. How do we establish the differences between what's inside or outside? When the people talk a lot about entering the neighborhood, there is no door from which they come in and leave. But there is, through this concept, a door. So we can, this is just one example of how we can make network of the people and the different phenomena that is noticed before and after. So the person, when they talk to us, is showing us the learning, the social learning process. They're a medium in order to arrive to this in the society. So this can also be made objective. And so in order to do this, we use the subjective relation. And if I see another person, this does happen, that not all of anthropologists see the same thing. So that's where the subjective component enters. Not all of it is subjective, totally. So it's something that can be seen in the same observers, whether the natives or the colleagues from the UK. So I've not yet noticed a distinction here, but it's going to come out at some point. In the classical anthropology, there was a lot of envy in these topics. If I work in a certain zone, no one else can work in this zone. So I work in an island, and that's where I'm going to do my field work. It's the same with the volcanoes. Ask Danielle. It's the same thing, in the same way. Yes. So it's a formal way saying that my formal way of seeing the natives is the only way of seeing the natives. The historians have the same way of seeing things. Don't worry about it. So if we accept the partial perspective, and among more perspectives, it's more enriched. So it will make us see things from a different perspective. So it helps us for people from the outside to tell us how they see us. So I don't think we're going to have a battle about the interpretation of the work that we do in the community. So let's just accept the impartial view. No result is without errors. So with more perspectives, that gives us an advantage. So one topic that's important is the story of science, that all of us our formation is from Western science. So we're going to have different perspectives, those who are from Ecuador, those who are from the UK, but the epistemology comes from the same place, whether we're from a different place. So it's important to understand the story of the different disciplines and where they come from. And there's a lot there about your question, Danielle, about the objectivity. How is it constructed through the idea of what is objective? And Amy could help us with this idea about the construction of the way of thinking from the Western perspective. Thank you, everyone, for attending this seminar. Thank you, Alfredo. Many things are staying in my head about this presentation. I thought volcanology was the youngest science of all, but now I see that we're working together, both young disciplines. All of the disciplines are relatively young. So next week, there will be no seminar. We have the investigation of the early career researchers and the meeting of these researchers. So we're not going to have a seminar next week, but then the following week, we will begin and we will let you know what topic we're going to present. I wish you all a great week, and we will see you in 2 weeks at the next seminar. Have a great week, everyone.
Gracias.
Semana, chao.
Cuídense. Chao.